On June 23, 1942, in South Wales, 180 miles west of London, a solitary Focke-Wulf 190 was observed to travel through scattered cumulus clouds, spewing irregular bursts of black smoke from its engines. Inside the cramped cockpit, 22-year-old Oberleutnant Armin Faber tasted copper and felt the sweating in his palms as the compass needle twisted uncontrollably. The fuel gauge was dangerously close to empty, and in less than 6 minutes, he would touch down on British soil with the 3rd Reich's most advanced fighter aircraft intact. The message was already written in the sky, making it impossible for any RAF officer to believe what they were witnessing. A German ace fleeing for his life, a British airfield team preparing for a routine training day. The landing was so catastrophic for the Luftwaffe that it would have changed the course of aerial warfare throughout the rest of the war. However, Faber was focused on one thing at the time: his search for the coast of France before his fuel tanks ran out and his fighter became his coffin, starting from Mole Airfield in occupied Brittany 40 minutes earlier. A standard escort patrol protecting bombers returning from a raid on Plymouth, but nothing was standard since Britain refused to surrender. The experience of crossing the Channel every time was like to tossing dice with death. This afternoon, the dice came up against the British Spitfires, which struck from the clouds with murderous intent. Faber's wingman peeled through his engine and drew thick black smoke as he headed home. Faber flexed his stick hard to the right, sensed the impact of cannon fire, punches through his wing, and heard a sharp electronic squealing. He quickly reacted to his pursuers by shaking them with pure instinct and training, realizing the horror of his nightmare. The situation had no clue where he was, as the compass was dead. There was no way to find the French coast. The FW-90 shuddered once more, coughing like a sickle. Faber looked down. The fuel pressure needle was dropping rapidly. He pondered the horizon, hoping for the familiar outline of Britain's coastline, and then suddenly saw something that made his chest tighten with relief. The English Channel is a stretch of silver-blue water that runs between two land masses. He followed the water towards the east, believing that he was on the French coast. However, Armin Faber discovered that the Bristol Channel was not France's territory, and it was actually Wales, which was enemy territory. He was oblivious to the fact that his compass had failed during the dogfight, causing him to spin around 180 degrees. His desperate dive through the clouds had completely lost track of his flight. He had no idea that he was moving deeper into British airspace with every passing second. The engine failed for 2 seconds, causing Faber's heart to pound against his ribs. It took only a few minutes for the engine to fail completely. A patchwork of green and brown moss in the Welsh countryside was visible below him. He saw a cluster of buildings, and it appeared to be an airfield. Thank goodness. The airfield at Focke-Wulf was definitely in German hands, didn't he? Faber circled the area once, examining the terrain below. He observed rows of aircraft, hangars, a control tower, and fuel trucks that were organized and professional. But the RAF roundels on those parked aircraft failed to elicit any notice from him from the smoke-filled goggles, prompting him to drop his landing gear. The hydraulic system slowed down, leaving the FW-190 mired in the air like a fatigued bird. Faber positioned himself before the debriefing, the mechanics cursing over the fighter he had just shot, and the ready room was filled with strong coffee and cigarettes. Dennis Cook, another tenant of RAF Pembrey, stood outside the control tower, observing the training flight taxi into position. The war in South Wales was peaceful on Tuesday afternoon, with only radio reports and distant explosions. The next thing you know, it was a normal, predictable, safe situation. A sergeant heard, "Incoming aircraft, single engine, damaged, unknown type." Cook turned to protect his eyes from the sun. The aircraft that came down from the southeast, trailing smoke, was unlike any he had ever seen before, with a nose that was too long, wings too short, and an incorrect profile. His stomach dropped. "That's a Jerry," Someone breathed next to him. The word rippled through the crowd gathering on the tarmac. This German adversary is now present. With their landing gear down, Cook walked down the runway. Was this a false assumption? The radar malfunctioned, and the aircraft was unable to surrender, dropping to a depth of 200 ft. The aircraft was not firing, and there were no explosive devices detected. The only indication of harm was a fighter who was hurt while making their way home, despite the fact that their home was 200 meters southeast across enemy waters. Cook screamed, "Shut up! Nobody's going to shoot!" as some airmen seized rifles from the armory, while others stood motionless, watching an unimaginable event unfold before them. In the middle of the day, a German fighter landed at an RAF base with minimal attention to detail, with only the runway rising to meet him and the approach markers and windshack displaying gentle crosswinds. The landing was typical, but it was all well and good. He stepped back on the throttle. The engine slowed down and then stopped. There was no sound from the wind, and the FW-190's nose dipped a little. Faber made a comeback, holding the stick firm, gliding and committed. There was no go around, even if desired. The fighter bowed once, settled, and rolled down the middle of the runway, losing momentum with the tail wheel touching down. The landing was flawless. With a textbook in front of him, he breathed deeply and felt tension in his shoulders. He had made it home, safe and sound. With the engine cooling and metal cooling, he let the FW-190 come to a stop close to the control tower. He then popped the canopy and inhaled some fresh Welsh air before reaching for his harness. And that's how they found them. They were wearing British uniforms with rifles pointed directly at his cockpit. The aircraft was parked with roundels painted on the tower, and his blood turned into ice water, not in accordance with France. He landed in Britain and felt a physical shiver on his face as his hands remained on the canopy rail. A group of 12 British pilots gathered in a semicircle, with arms raised and faces raised in shock, confusion, and dismay. Flight Lieutenant Cook approached the young German pilot, looking up at the ground, while his face had changed to chalk white with alarm. The next day, he spoke slowly in German, but had been relearning from his school days. Hay instructed him to release his hands from the aircraft. Faber comprehended and stood in the cockpit with his trembling hands. He stood at almost 6 feet tall, had dark hair spread across his forehead by sweat, and had a small cut above his left eye. He was dressed in the usual Luftwaffe flight suit and held an iron cross at his chest, having shot down 7 Allied planes in just 4 months, and now being held captive. His thoughts were consumed by sadness. How? What had transpired? He had walked along the shoreline. He mistook the compass, which must have been damaged in combat, and resulted in him getting the exact opposite direction, the worst he could have done. 2 British pilots approached with caution, holding their weapons. Faber emerged from the cockpit, his legs almost twitch as his boots made contact with foreign land. The pilot was caught by the elbows, not roughly, but with great force, demonstrating a shift away from military protocol. "Jesus Christ!" was shouted in English by one of them. Cook holstered his revolver and drew nearer to the aircraft, watching it closely. The Focke-Wulf Fw 190. The news of the new German fighter, including intelligence reports and pilot debriefs, was accompanied by fears that it would surpass the Spitfire Mark V in speed, climb, and weight. Yet it remained undamaged and unharmed, with only a small amount of damage, despite some bullet holes, and an occasional fuel leak. The engine was still warm, with all available systems and secrets being revealed. Cook felt his pulse. This was more than just a pilot caught in the crossfire. Faber was positioned between 2 guards, with his hands now secured behind his back by canvas straps. The German's face displayed anguish, shame, and horror, just like that of a man who had just committed an unforgivable act. Cook contacted Sergeant Morris, and arranged for Group Captain Wilson to reach him. "Call RAF Farah and let them know we have something for them." Morris made his way towards the tower. Around the W190, airmen gathered, touching the metal skin, looking into the cockpit and examining the heavy nose-mounted cannons and wide-track landing gear. Take a closer look at the exhaust stubs, which are the size of the BMW 801 radial engine with 14 cylinders, and the mechanic is present. Another screamed. "This thing must be speedy." A young pilot, who was only 19, looked at the plane with reverence. "Our boys are fighting these." Cook nodded in disbelief. "We'll uncover every detail of them." Faber was directed to a small brick edifice that was the station's office. He walked unsteadily and mechanically, his mind attempting to comprehend the extent of his failure. He had given Britain the best possible fighter and had betrayed every detail of the FW-90's performance, giving the enemy precisely what they needed to counter German air superiority. The intensity of the realization was overwhelming. Inside the office, there were 2 RAF officers, including Captain Hughes, an intelligence officer who had been summoned from the operations room and spoke German fluently. Hughes began by saying, "Und Faber," but his tone was not revealing. Faber nodded in agreement, acknowledging that he is a prisoner of war and will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. For a moment, Hughes paused to listen to him. "You're not the first German pilot to be captured on our airfield, but you land on one of them voluntarily, according to Faber's statement. He didn't say, 'I did it on purpose. I thought it was over France.'" Hughes provided a brief, humorous response, asking for the other officer's compass. Faber looked down. "I was hit by a bullet during the battle and saw the channel, but thought he was incapable of finishing." The magnitude of the mistake was overwhelming. Hughes reclined in his chair. "It's been a terrible day, Lieutenant," he declared, "and many pilots agree that you are alive." Faber's jaw clenched, causing him to feel vulnerable, but ashamed. He was captured and may have caused the deaths of thousands of German soldiers as Allied pilots honed their skills to exploit every flaw in the FW-90. It felt like he was on the brink of survival. A medic arrived with a small medical kit. He approached Faber with caution, reaching for the open wound. Faber paused and nodded, and the medic proceeded to clean the wound with an antiseptic that stung like a fire. He flinched, but didn't retreat. The medic put on some bandages and walked back to the room. In English, he said, "You'll be fine." Faber was perplexed by the same professionalism and human dignity. The British were labelled as cruel and obnoxious foes in everything he heard about. Nevertheless, in the first hour of his confinement, the FW-190 was already being photographed from every vantage point. Captain Wilson's staff car had also arrived, kicking up dust as it stopped near the plane. He shuffled around it at a leisurely pace, his weathered face visibly emotionless. But his mind was calculating. This aircraft, still intact, represented an intelligence breakthrough that could change the air war for the better. RAF pilots had been reporting encounters with this new German fighter that outperformed their Spitfire fees in the most recent dive. The FW-190's increased roll rate and heavier firepower were causing significant damage to British formations, but pilots were now willing to surrender. The RAF would dismantle the engine, scrutinize the fuel injection system, and examine the armament. Test pilots would take it under extreme pressure, expose its weaknesses, and distribute new tactics to every squadron within a few weeks. Attack from above, coerce them into engaging in pivotal battles, take advantage of the FW-90's subpar performance, target the cooling system, and learn when to fire, which could have saved hundreds of Allied lives. Wilson enlisted the services of an operational officer to ensure that the plane was always under armed protection. It requires permission from Fabora, and the transportation team must be present by morning. The officer gave a quick salute and left. Wilson surveyed the tower where Faber was being held. A proficient pilot who had made a calamitous error. They could have sipped, talked about flying, and exchanged tactical notes, but in reality, war had no tolerance for honest mistakes. Faber was seated in the office, his hands hanging still, staring at the floor. Captain Hughes had left to coordinate with intelligence services in London. The two guards stationed at the door seemed uneasy about how to treat a prisoner who had landed and been held captive. Davis, one of the corporals, cleared the throat. "Would you like some water?" Faber looked shocked. Davies held a canteen in his hand. Faber hesitated, then nodded. Davis placed it with great care. He was allowed to drink. The water was cool and clean, the most refreshing drink Faber had ever experienced. Davies nodded and stepped back. The uncomplicated yet unforeseen act of kindness caused Faber to experience a burning sensation in his eyes and avoid crying in front of his captives. Nevertheless, the gravity of what he had done was overwhelming, and his failure was felt almost verbally. He had been certain that he was flying home safely, making the correct decisions, but they were all completely incorrect. By sunset, news of the capture had reached all levels of British government. Prime Minister Churchill was reported to be smiling as a gift from the Luftwaffe. It was a great thing to us. It's time to send a thank you note to them. At RAF Pembrey, the Air Fighting Development Unit was getting ready to handle the introduction of the FW-90s. Test pilots, engineers, intelligence analysts, and everyone else wanted to witness this iconic fighter. The morning after that, a team of experts in transportation arrived at RAF Pembrey with equipment to meticulously dismantle the FW-190's wings for road transportation. The ground crew treated the aircraft as if it were an essential artifact, treating it with reverence and respect. Faber felt physically sick, having flown in from his temporary cell. That was his fighter, his aircraft, the machine he had trusted with his life 12 times. The building was being dismantled, scrutinized, and violated due to his incorrect direction, trusting in his own mistakes and misguided conclusions. Captain Hughes arrived with a supply of bread, cheese, or tea. "I thought you might be hungry," but Faber didn't, and he nodded off. Hughes placed the tray on the table and put a chair in it. "You'll be taken to some P camp in the north tomorrow. It's not all glitz and pleasure, but the situation is manageable. The war will come to an end eventually. You'll come back home." Would Germany be willing to reinstate the pilot who conducted Britain's most significant intelligence operation during the air war, or would his name be disparaged, his family be ashamed, and his service record be tarnished? It appeared that Hugh comprehended his thoughts. "I know that you didn't do well. This mistake was what set you apart." According to Hughes, Faber didn't answer the question, but you made the right decision. You were lost, almost ran out of fuel, and flying a damaged plane. You could have crashed into the sea, died alone. You didn't achieve anything. Instead, you chose to live. "I gave you everything," Faber muttered quietly. "I'm not saying that you didn't do it. Your FW-90 is important. We'll save pilots and possibly revolutionize this air warfare. Nevertheless, it's not shame to carry yourself alone. Your commanders sent you up in smoke with a faulty compass. You were not adequately prepared for disorientation, and your training didn't adequately prepare you for this. At 22 years old, you were alone, making last-minute decisions with a lack of information." Faber looked up at Hughes's eyes for the first time and acknowledged, "You are trying to make me feel better about betraying my country." Hughes shook his head. "I'm making an effort to save you from prison for the next 5 years. Guilt will consume you in the long run. Trust me, you've seen it happen." He stood and headed towards the entrance. "Get some rest and eat. Tomorrow we'll have a lengthy drive." After leaving, Faber sat alone with the tray that remained untouched. He saw the FDA 190 being loaded onto the transport truck, its distinctive profile wrapped in canvas and rope. It was his fighter, his mistake, and his legacy. He picked up a piece of bread, forced himself to eat. The food tasted like ashes, but Hughes was correct. His survival depended on his ability to endure, as Armin Faber, a disgraced and defiant Luftwaffe ace pilot, was still breathing. Despite this, his determination to keep on breathing was more important in war than any other factor. The Fw 190 arrived at RAF Farnborough after 3 days. The engineers arrived with minimal enthusiasm and documented every aspect of the situation. The BMW 801 engine was removed, tested on a dynamometer, and its power curves were plotted. Additionally, the armament was examined using 2 7.92mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. The debilitating firepower, fuel injection system, landing gear, and clear view from the cockpit were all highlighted, setting it apart from British designs. Roland Bent, the chief test pilot, flew it over 24 times in the next few weeks, scrutinizing its strengths and weaknesses with scientific analysis. This was a triumph of German engineering at its most basic. However, it required some work to perfect the maneuvers and flight conditions. With each flight, test, and report, the RAF's tactics underwent a transformation. Squadron leaders were given new briefings. Pilots were taught about the strengths and weaknesses of their aircraft, while the German fighter was replaced by hard data and effective countermeasures. After Faber's landing in September 1942, RAF squadrons began utilizing new tactics to exploit the weaknesses of the Fw 190s, leading to a decrease in loss rates and an improvement in kill ratios. This led to incremental changes in the air war, but ultimately helped Britain win the war. Historians later estimated that the capture of this aircraft savored hundreds of Allied lives, cut down costs, and contributed materially to air superiority over Europe. A single pilot's mishap led to a broken compass, impossible landing, and rumors about RAF pilots winning engagements they would have lost months earlier. His name was also heard with disgust by other German prisoners who held him responsible for their fellow captives' deaths in northern England. In the evening, he sat in his bunk and contemplated questions with no clear solution. Should he have fallen into the sea rather than landed, and should have killed himself instead of succumbing to captivity? The guilt was a heavy burden on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. However, beneath the shame, there was something else, which was quieter, but more durable. Relief was present. On a daily basis, young men were dying in fighters, bombers, and ships, with injuries such as burning, drowning, or burning. Faber stood in the P-camp yard, observing the frost melting in light of the cold November morning in 1942. He had survived despite the cost of death, which may have been accidental. An older man, Kraus, who was a bomber pilot, approached another prisoner who had been shot down over Kent. He quietly stated, "It was the landing, not the Fw 90. Faber was anxious, but he shook his head. As usual, it wasn't at this point, so it was. It's not uncommon for even the most skilled navigators to experience navigational difficulties. I once misread a landmark and flew 40 kilometers in the wrong direction. Luckily, I was able to do it before crossing into Switzerland." Kraus shrugged off the fact that war is a chaotic situation. We practice. Despite our best efforts, we occasionally make mistakes. The only difference is that chance can be deadly. Faber was slapped on the shoulder. The only thing holding you back is the fact that you survived. Let the politicians and generals take care of the rest. Faber nodded in a relaxed manner. Despite the loss incurred by the Luftwaffe, the guilt was not erased, and the war persisted despite the fact that his mistake was understandable and forgivable. The young fighters on both sides perished in the ensuing fire and shattered glass. Nevertheless, the balance shifted, in part because a single German ace had made one major mistake and chose to survive. After the war ended and the prisoners were repatriated, Armin Faber was sent back to Germany without any charges or formal punishment. The devastation caused by defeat had wiped out numerous files and concealed numerous failures. He transitioned from military service, married, and worked as an engineer, but he hardly ever talked about the war or the landing at RAF Pembrey. Nevertheless, on rare, calm evenings, there was a chance to look back at the sky and recall the tactile sensation of the WWII's controls. The dread of discovering his whereabouts, the oddity of being taken hostage, and the weight of the knowledge that his misstep had changed the course of history. And he would think about all the pilots who didn't make it back home, the young men who perished rather than land in the wrong place. He never realized if he had made the right decision and pondered survival until the morning in June 1942, when his fuel gauge showed 0 and his compass malfunctioned inexplicably. This realization caught him off guard. He had made a decision to choose life over death, land on his own instead of crash, and continue breathing for an extra day. The FW-190, which Armin Faber unintentionally brought to RAF Pembrey, was later exhibited in museums, studied at military meets, documented in numerous accounts of aerial combat, showcasing both German engineering prowess and the profound influence of one-time errors in navigation. Despite being the first to greet Faber on an impossible day, Flight Lieutenant Dennis Cook wrote in his memoirs that only one aircraft mattered during his time at Pembrey, not because of the pilot's skill or significance, but because it was the most remarkable moment of war. The sun setting over RAF Pembrey on June 23, 1942, where a young pilot had walked into captivity and the air war had turned into an invisibility yet again. This was an incredible event that marked the beginning of an unknown unknown to usher in on the greater meaning of what life. For this day, in 1945, while in a cell eating bread without the ability to taste, Armin Faber was caught unawares of the intelligence disaster in Germany. He had no idea that the British were systematically exposing their advanced fighters' secrets under British lights in their hangars. The war had numerous small victories, including one pilot who was confused, one compass he couldn't make, and one that resulted in an impossibly impractical landing, all of which changed in just 5 minutes.